For those who know Psygnosis, they were a British video game developer founded in the 1980s, eventually becoming SCE Studio Liverpool until their closure in 2012. They were also responsible for intellectual properties like the anti-gravity racer Wipeout and the space shooter Conley Wars, but there was another sci-fi property from the UK-based studio. G-Police arrived for the Sony PlayStation and PC in 1997, the same year Conley Wars came onto the scene, yet like Conley Wars Red Sun that released 3 years later, G-Police was made by a sub-studio of Psygnosis, specifically a team from Stroud, England. The game was successful but wasn't faultless when still relevant, so how does it fare all these years later? In the future, Earth's resources have been depleted, though humanity had expanded into the solar system. Unfortunately, after years of conflict, all governments demilitarized, resulting in megacorporations gaining power, thus spreading their influence across all colonies in Sol. Consequently, the inception of the G-Police, or government police, was for maintaining order, but Slater, the protagonist, doesn't trust them, believing their personnel lack authority, turn a blind eye with dubious agreements, and the Havoc, a VTOL-like gunship they operate, is outdated. He also doesn't believe his sister, Elaine, a G-Police officer, committed suicide while serving on Jupiter's moon Callisto. Being a war veteran and suspicious of her fate, Slater joins the G-Police on discovering what caused his sister's demise. Slater starts tackling with gangs, but eventually he'll be engaging private armies, with missions like preventing enemies reaching their goal, protecting friendly units, blowing up bases and so on. All 35 levels begin with a mission briefing, and weapons are pre-selected. Moreover, you get more choices as the game progresses, later gaining access to a better craft with greater agility and top speed. At the time, many gamers, and even now depending on whom you ask, cited the controls were dodgy, except I disagree. Although I approve the default setup jeopardizes fun, this can be resolved by remapping the controls, and G-Police has training levels separate from the main campaign, which is good for testing custom setups before going into the deep end. But, for what I've experienced, the analog sensitivity is notably high when navigating and killing opponents. Ironically, the stick is more favourable because quick agility is imperative for success, not only for when being outnumbered, but also the chances of being outgunned, and there's no worse feeling of facing against a convoy who are armed to the teeth, firing non-stop, whereas you're running low on ammo with a small fraction of health. Fortunately, there are rearm stations for resupplying weapons as well as replenishing health, but even those aren't reliable considering they're only usable once, and during the process you're susceptible to attack, hence knowing when to rearm is essential. That said, switching weapons frequently becomes the norm. However, by enabling analog control, the D-pad's up and down keys scrolls for your firepower, otherwise it's done with circle, assuming the default controls are in effect. During each operation, a wingman will provide assistance, but their utility is limited as they only use their cannon. In normal circumstances, they should have the same weaponry as you and consequently take full advantage. On top of that, they can be shot down, not just by the opposition but even yourself. Likewise, enemies aren't intelligent. Although they do pose a threat when grouped, unless the adversary is a gunboat, their behaviour doesn't adjust beyond point and shoot. Some fights are so hectic, they'll either force you to a rearm station, or you wait for your health to recharge, which takes an absolute age, and if you perish you're restarting the level again. That's not to say there weren't moments of excitement. For instance, taking out foes and watching them crash and burn is satisfying, and combat improves once you get your hands on an upgraded gunship. It's just the absence of checkpoints and basic AI inhibit the experience, not to mention some missions become trite. The game comes on 2 discs, so switching between them becomes mandatory. Nonetheless, if you're playing on the PS3 port, like I was, both are accessed via the home button. In terms of visuals, it depends on the platform, though as I'm reviewing the PlayStation version they haven't aged well, at times containing muddy textures. Conversely, I do like the aesthetics, and if you're wondering it resembles Blade Runner, that's because the film was an inspiration during development. It's a shame they're undermined by a short draw distance, and while there are options to change this, the viewing angle and frame rate, what you prioritise in is at the cost of the other two. However, regardless of setup, it doesn't change the fact, especially when flying at high altitudes, so I hope you like the colour black. Yes, the radar helps with situational awareness, besides telling where the next objective is, but it would be also ideal if the map showed where you were facing, and since resupplying is a thing, having to pull up the map less wouldn't be as irksome. Anyway, the music is appropriate, putting aside its generic and repetitious, though the sound effects are pretty good, as well as the voice acting, which is important because I found Slater's story engaging, despite some aspects being cliché within its genre. In short, G-Police has an attention-grabbing narrative, though it's at the gameplay's expense. Combat isn't perfect, plus some objectives overstay their welcome, yet there are moments of enjoyment. The default controls may be moot depending on your preference, still remapping buttons is beneficial, besides upon being compatible with analog and digital inputs. Fortunately for Psygnosis, the game was successful and G-Police Weapons of Justice became the sequel in 1999, but whether I think it's a step up is another matter. G-Police may be flawed, at least the paperwork isn't part of it.